going to look at 1 Corinthians chapter 7. He starts out by saying in verse 1, now concerning the things you wrote to me about. They had written him some letters and asking him some questions. One of the questions was about marriage, celibacy, staying married, and those kinds of things. And so he answers a lot of those questions here in chapter 7. In verse 1, he says, it's good not to touch a woman. In other words, it's good not to have sex with a woman at all. He's talking about being celibate. He says, if you want to be celibate, that's a great lifestyle. He says, that's what I am in this chapter, and it's a good way to go. But in verse 2, he says, because of sexual immorality, let each one have his own wife. In other words, because of the immorality in the world today, you're going to be exposed to sex, and man, it couldn't be even more true than it is today. It's a good idea also to get married. You see, marriage is the only way to express your sexuality in a godly way in this world. There's no other means that God has put together for us to do that. And so he says, in that case, it's a good idea to be married. And throughout this whole chapter, he's going to go back and forth presenting positives and negatives of being married and being single. And he says either one, both are good. Both are a gift from God. He kind of favors himself being single, and in verses 25 through 40, he gives 6 reasons why it's not a bad idea just to remain single. But here in the first part of the chapter, he's talking about it's maybe a good idea to get married. In verse 3, he says, let the husband render to his wife the affection due her. In other words, she has sexual needs, and the husband needs to meet those needs. That is his obligation. In verse 4, he goes a step further and says, your body is not your own. Husband, your body belongs to your wife. Wife, your body belongs to your husband. And I hope that you understand that, you who are married, that sex is not a dirty thing, a bad thing. It's actually a gift from God, and it's something that we need to relish. When you got married, you became one flesh, and you and your wife are one. And that means you don't own your body anymore, and she doesn't own her body anymore. You own each other. He says in verse 4, he goes on to say, verse 5, don't deprive each other. This is happening in so many marriages today, and this is why we see such immorality in marriage. This is why you see so many things happening. They're just, outside of God's plan. There's sexual deprivation in marriage. There's deals going on like, well, as long as you make me happy and you do what I want you to do, then we can have sex. That was never God's plan. He says maybe you'll deprive each other for a very short time for a spiritual reason. You're fasting, you're focusing on God. Okay, great, but then come back together when you're done. In other words, don't think of reasons why not to have sex when you're married. Now, he moves on. In verse 8, he says, to the unmarried, to the widows, if they can stay married, unless they have a hard time exercising self-control. He says, if you're not married or you're a widow, just go ahead and stay that way, unless self-control is an issue with you, unless you have a burning desire in you to, be, inside of a physical relationship. Now, in our generation, that's most people. Now, in verses 10 through 16, he switches gears a little bit, and he says, now, if you're married, and you're married to somebody who is not a believer, what do you do? Well, he answers that question by saying this. If you're married to an unbeliever, and the unbeliever is happy to stay married to you, maybe life isn't that great. Obviously, you don't see eye to eye. Maybe you married him, and you just made a big mistake, and you were saved, and he wasn't. Maybe you got saved after the marriage, and now things just don't work all that well. He says, you're obligated to stay with this unbelieving husband or this unbelieving wife. He says, the Lord says this. In verse 10, he says, not I, but Jesus said this. And, he makes an observation. He says, your kids are in a lot better shape because you're married. He says in verse 14, the children would be unclean. In other words, it's better for them to have one believing uh, mom or dad than two unbelieving. And so you need to stay with that person. Now he makes an exception. He says, if this unbeliever doesn't want to stay with you and they leave you or they divorce you, then you're free to remarry. There's nothing you can do about that. But if they're free, if they want to stay with you, then you need to stay with them. And that's a hard thing to swallow for some people. Some people are like, man, but I don't like being married to this person. I could be married to someone else and be a lot happier. Too bad. These are the words of Jesus. And make the most of it. And he says toward the end here, how do you know whether you're going to influence your husband or your wife to be saved? You don't know. So pray for them and see what God does. In verses 17 through 24, he addresses just discontent. Some people were discontent with being circumcised. Some people were discontent with being uncircumcised. Some people were discontent with being married. Some people were discontent with being unmarried. Some people were discontent with being a slave. It just over and over. He says, stay where you're at. However you were when God called you, stay that way. Focus on something other than your discontent. And he talks about slavery here a little bit, and he doesn't say slavery is something that is great. He's not even addressing the social practice of it. He's saying if you are a slave, stay that way and be free in God's eyes. Now again, in verse 25 through 40, he addresses celibacy again, and he gives really 6 reasons why it may not be a bad reason to remain celibate. He says in verses 25 through 27, because of the pressures of the world system. In verses 28, because of the problems of the flesh. In verse 29 through 31, because of the passing of the world. Because of the preoccupation of marriage, because of the promises a father made about his daughter being single forever. And then last, because of the permanency of marriage, because marriage is going to go on and you may make a mistake. But overall, he says either one is a good decision. If you feel tension, sexual tension, this is the way that you're going to relieve that. And so either way you go, it's okay. I hope that you'll read this passage, let God speak to you. If you're married, understand your body is not your own. If you're married, you're not in a good marriage, understand that if this believer wants to stay with you, this unbeliever wants to stay with you, then that's your role to be with them until God saves them or until God takes one of you home. Well, you have a great day, and we'll see you tomorrow. God bless you.